In planning, how are you going to adapt to the changes that are coming? We always talk about shortages of oil. Well, let's not talk about shortages of oil. Let's talk about shortages of oil infrastructure. All right? Remember back to Katrina? Dig out those old gas and food receipts. Remember the jolt that we got after all of that infrastructure was wiped out? Well, that's what happens. Now, how's that going to affect us? Well, as natural catastrophes start to happen, we're going to see a contraction, and it's going to come in a series of contractions of the nation's ability to provide continuous 24/7 energy. And consequently, we're going to see rolling brownouts, rolling blackouts, and they're going to happen all too frequently. So that means each of us needs to find a way to get as far off the grid as possible. And that means working with what you have in your budget. To help us do that, we have Daniel Dean. He's the CEO and Chief Engineer for Greenland Energy Dynamics, a firm based outside of Dallas, Texas, that specializes in getting people off the grid. And he's got a very respectable list of people who are coming to his business, and frankly, the guy's just on fire, can barely keep up with demand. And so what I'd like to do is bring Dan on, and we're going to talk about things you can do about getting off the grid, and I'm talking about getting off the grid so you can survive the earth changes that are coming for everybody's budget. And so I'd like to introduce to the show Daniel Green. Dan, thanks for coming on.
Hello, Marshall. How are you this evening?
Well, I'm excellent. I am excellent, and I'm really glad you come on for this first show, just so the audience knows that Dan and I joined with Dan and other gentlemen, and we had a nice paddle down the river in Arkansas. That was quite a 3-day expedition. We did 35 miles of the river, and that was a heck of a bonding experience. So let me put it to you this way, folks.
Grid, huh?
Yeah, it really was. Boy, we were off of society. We were off of everything, and so I'm used to putting my life in your hands, and I'm comfortable with it, and that's what I'd like for my listeners to know. So first off, Dan, why don't you just tell people a little bit about what Greenland Energy is doing, and what you think folks in the mainstream, down on Main Street, can do within limited budgets to get as far off the flipping grid as possible.
All right. Well, Greenland started out as a company providing alternative energy products such as solar electric, solar thermal, geothermal heating and air conditioning, standby generators, LED lighting, anything that would reduce the consumption of energy in a house. And we didn't really target going off-grid. This kind of came by customers asking us and saying, look, I really want to get off the grid. I don't want the electric hooked up to my house, or what if the electricity goes off? What do I do? How can I, continue to function on a daily basis? Or they're concerned about the, increased pricing of electricity. And so we started designing systems for people that had estates or farms or a place that they wanted to completely take off grid and not have to worry about utilities in the future. Doesn't matter what the prices are. And we've developed into pretty good clientele. Some of them can develop build some very nice estates. And some of them, can't, so we try to help them the best we can. We each have a budget. I think where you were talking about helping people on Main Street, that's the big area that we like to help people. I think there's a lot of practical and simple things that we can do in our homes, the things that we can expect, and this is an opinion, but it's an educated opinion. Every 10 years, energy prices or electric prices double. We know that just from historical data. We also know that we've got the carbon footprint tax that's coming along that's going to impose a 30% tax just right off the board on our energy bills. We know that we've got tiered pricing on energy. Like California already has, I think, a 4-tiered pricing structure. Texas is trying to get that through the legislature to where we may pay 10 cents a kilowatt hour right now, but only for a very limited amount of energy, and we could pay in the upwards of 36, 37 cents a kilowatt hour. And people are concerned about that because that's going to make some drastic cuts on their budgets, big impact, especially at a time when corporate America is cutting back on salaries, trying to equalize salaries within the corporate structures. A lot of people are unemployed. They're on one income right now.
Well, I'll tell you, it's bloody hell out there. We were just we just finished a huge move, getting into a new place. It was time for me to bust a move and to get to where I needed to be for 2012, and I got here, and it gave me a chance to see what's happening out, particularly in the rental market out there. And you know, Dan, it's just ugly. You have families that are in foreclosures and short sales, you know, and evictions. It's just awful, and the slumlords and the predators are out there like never before, just to rip these poor people off. And you know, and I know that there's a lot of folks out there that are really sweating something like that happening, and so you know, it's getting off the grid is one of those things. You know, do you do it before or after you make those minimum credit card payments that seem to be not so minimum anymore? And finding the little things, that's helpful. Yeah.
My grown son was just telling me the other day that he's getting advertisements for credit cards now that are upwards of 17 to 24%, no longer the 6 or 7 or 8 or 9% credit cards. And so we were already
what rate? What was that?
16 to 24%.
On a solicitation?
Solicitation, amazing. He was telling me about it. He said he couldn't believe it. You know, he normally gets them for 6 or 7 or 9, maybe 10%, 9.99%. A bad one would be 14%. And I was amazed to see some of them that he was showing me. And it's like, well, the hyperinflationary cycle has begun. Of course, we've been watching gold and silver, and we know that's occurring. So we just need to try to embrace ourselves and prepare for it.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, for the families that are out there, I know that in my particular case, getting out in, we got out in a rural area, and I've switched over pretty heavily to, you know, propane and firewood. You know, get myself away from electric as much as possible. For the average person, though, I mean, you know, is propane and firewood going to work for them if they're in the cities?
Well, it's a good question. I think that propane is questionable. It's very up to the city code and where they live. If someone can get propane, whether their house is running on propane right now or not, and they don't have natural gas available to them, I would have it put in their house. And I'll explain in a moment. I think the first thing that I would suggest to everyone out there, unless they're getting ready to build a nice, you know, off-grid underground bunker or whatever, is to buy a small gasoline-powered generator, diesel or gasoline. It doesn't matter. Just make sure it's reliable. Make sure it's a good product that you can get parts for easily and that you can afford it.
Any brands you'd recommend?
Generac, Kohler, either one of them are good. There are some; those are parts are available for them everywhere. Generac outsells Kohler 3 to 1, but Kohler is probably the best engine for generators out there in the small world. Now, there's other ones out there that are good. You know, Lincoln Arc Welders also makes generators that are good. I think that there's some other companies that are just now trying to get into that small generator market. We're talking about 8,000 watts, somewhere between 7,000 and 8,000 watts, not 2,500 watts. And they're
okay. And what can you run on 7,000 to 8,000 watts for, let's say, a typical family of 4 or 5? You know, mom, dad, couple of kids. Is that really going to be useful for them?
Well, it will keep a refrigerator going. It will keep lights going. It will allow for radios. It will even allow for TVs. It will allow for an oven, electric oven, to be on. You know, the big energy robbers in a house that we have to be concerned about, Marshall, are, number one, your heating and air conditioning system. If it's not gas, if it's electric, especially electric heat, is the worst there is. If it's a heat pump, that's okay. And then your air conditioning. Okay. Next is going to be your electric water heater. Number 3 is an electric dryer, and then electric ovens, and then electric stovetops. Those are your big offenders for energy usage in a house. Most people don't know that an electric dryer actually consumes the same amount of energy as a 5-ton air conditioner in the middle of the summer. That's a lot of energy. So there's some things that we can do about that. Now, you know, we're talking about an oven using 4,500 watts and a refrigerator using about 800 watts, 900 watts. And we're talking about a generator being able to put out 7,000 watts. The first thing, let's talk about how do we hook this thing up real quick. The easiest thing to do is, if you have an electric dryer outlet in your house, is you will plug the power cord from the generator at the 220 power cord into that dryer plug, and that will provide power to the house. But let me give a stern warning. Make sure that the main breaker to your service panel is off. You will cause all sorts of sparks and things to go pop if it's not. So be careful, but it's a practical method for those people who want to be able to provide power during these rolling blackouts and rolling brownouts, because they're going to happen more and more. And
now, one of the things I'm looking here in the virtual studio, and one of the folks is asking about solar, electric, solar, hot water, solar generators, the whole solar angle. I know that, when I was in Israel, we took a holiday there some years ago. I was really impressed with the fact that almost every house had a solar hot water heater on it. Is that practical for America?
Absolutely. It is the second most cost-effective thing, but the single most affordable thing that you can do to your house. First, prepare for the blackouts, because get a little generator. You can find them on sale for $700 or $800, $900. You can find a Generac 7,000 or 8,000 watt generator for about $1,000, and it's a good machine. A Kohler's going to cost more than that. Both of them have plenty of parts. I advocate both of them, and there's some other good ones out there. Do that first. Then I would recommend, especially if we're on a budget, is look into a good solar hot water system. And I'm going to recommend that you look at a evacuated tube solar collector and not a flat panel or plate. The difference is the
Okay, you're going to have to, we definitely got to detail the difference on that.
I will detail the difference of how they look. A flat panel glaze simply looks like a piece of plywood that's been painted, and it's got some interesting texture to it. A evacuated tube looks like a bunch of large, clear fluorescent bulbs that are sticking into a header at the top. The difference is dramatic. The latter produces a lot more heat, and it's also portable. If for any reason you need to take to the road, you can go to Grandma's house, whatever you need to do. Each one of those little tubes simply screws out, and you remove the header, and you can take it with you. So it is portable. The flat panel glazed are not portable. So, and we'll get to that maybe perhaps later in the show if you want to talk about some simple ways in the event that you lose your home to a tornado or something, and you need to provide hot water and electricity. We can talk about that if you'd like to. But back to your question.
Yeah, well, one thing in general, if, again, like a family of 4 or 5, and, I see this, Dan, in contractions. All right, a lot of folks are thinking, well, when the really big catastrophes start to happen, it's all going to be one big bada boom. And that's not what I see. I see a series of contractions, like a woman in labor, really. And it's something where we start off with rolling brownouts, and then from there we graduate to rolling blackouts. And these blackouts might be a matter of a few minutes, a few hours during like peak time during the day when everyone's got those air conditioners turned on. Where we are over here in near the Silicon Valley, on a really hot summer day, it's a problem. They're on the radio telling folks, can you start turning things off? Do your laundry at night and that kind of stuff. But this is the problem that I see, is that we're going to have events like, well, we saw with the Fukushima plant in Japan, which really goes to prove General Electric is much better at evading taxes than it is at building nuclear reactors. But, they're dealing with, in the northern end of the country, now they're dealing with an energy problem. And if that progresses, then that contraction, that constriction becomes more. And if you have a short gap solution, that's one thing. But then at some point, you have to be able to almost become virtually independent to some degree. So if we're looking at this, in a long-term basis, my concern for folks out there is if you're taking an incremental approach to it, what will happen is that you're going to wind up competing for a lot of scarce resources when things are really bad. So those generators you're talking about, you could buy them today for $1,000. What happens if we're in a situation where there's rolling brownouts and blackouts? What do you think the price of those things is going to be?
we recently had a rolling blackout here during a really cold portion of the winter, and everybody's electric heat was on, and you couldn't find a generator anywhere in the state of Texas. They were sold out. Everybody went over and put them on their charge cards and bought them just to run their houses to keep heat on so they could keep from being cold, you know. If you run into a situation like that, the odds are there's not going to be one available for you, or the lead time would be a long time, and you need it now. That's something you need to invest in now. And rolling blackouts we know are going to occur. That's a safety issue. It's not an efficiency issue. Winter time is what we need to worry about. Wood is good. Use propane, and try to get propane gas furnace if you can, even if it's a standing one to go in the living room. If you have a fireplace, that's great, a wood-burning one. Some way to keep yourself warm in the wintertime without power. You may have to do that during these rolling blackouts. Number one, that's the number one thing. I think there's ultimately where we would like to be is we'd like to have a generator on, let's say, an average 2,000 square foot house. We would like to have a generator that's 17 to 22 kW. It's either running on natural gas or propane. It can run on diesel also. You need to make sure that you've got a long-term supply. If it's diesel, propane's easier to store, and then natural gas is endless until they turn it off. Then you need to start looking at the energy efficiency. The biggest vendor is heating and air conditioning. Geothermal heating and air conditioning is by far the most efficient product out there, but it's also the most expensive. It will drop the usage of energy by 90% for heating and cooling during the course of a year. It also costs about $7,000 a cooling ton to start. So if you have a 5-ton air conditioner, that means you're going to have to have about a $35,000 bill to put in geothermal. You get a 30% tax credit back from that from the government, but you still have to fund it up front. Long term, though, that's the biggest money saver. ROI is less than 5 years. Next to that, solar hot water. Solar hot water is something that you will always have, you know, whether the power's there or not. If the sun is out at all, if you have any kind of daylight, you're going to be generating hot water, and you can store it in your existing tank, or you can get one of the newer tanks that has super insulators on it. And then the next thing to look at is solar panels, so that whenever there is, let's say, an extended time of no power and you want to conserve the fuel of your generator, or you're running out of fuel, or there's no natural gas, that you can at least produce enough to run a refrigerator and run some lights and store them in batteries. And that's easy to do. That's an easy thing to do, and it's not very expensive to run a refrigerator and some lights. That's not very expensive. What gets expensive is whenever we have to run the whole house. So when we're completely off-grid, it gets more expensive. But most people can afford to buy 2 or 3 or 4 solar panels that are attached to a couple of big deep cycle batteries, and that will provide an entire night's worth of power for the refrigerator, for lights, for radios, whatever they might need to, stay comfortable. The hot water, if you're out of power, it'll provide hot water to bathe with, hot water to cook with. It'll produce more than enough hot water to, for a family of 4 to 5. We have people with 3 or 4 kids that one of these evacuated solar collectors, evacuated tube solar collectors, will provide 120 gallons of hot water for them a day. So,
well, it's interesting as you were talking about the solar water heaters. I mean, in the virtual studio, well, fellow looks like he's up in Alaska, AK survivor, and he said, well, what works up in the far north, and very little sun in the winter. So while solar is going to be a stronger thing for us living down in the moderate latitudes, but interestingly enough, Dan, the question is, for me, a curious thing, because one of the things that we're going to see with natural disasters, all right, is that we're going to have a lot of dust and debris floating around in the atmosphere. And so if you have a shortage of sunlight, whether it's due to dust and debris, in other words, nuclear winter scenario, or it's up in the north, is that going to make solar really something that is location dependent and something that is not necessarily going to be able to stay with us when things are really rough?
If things get rough, and let's assume they did. Let's say we had Yellowstone blew up and we went into really bad cloud cover, or we have nuclear winter, or any number of scenarios that might cause that. Solar is going to become, it will still work but it's not nearly as effective because the clouds act like a big filter. And most of us in the industry that are designing underground bunkers do not depend upon solar. We use wind, and because we believe that that wind will outlast solar in literally a global catastrophe. We use generators, and we use diesel generators, and we have them these generators charge batteries for us, as do wind generators. So your gentleman in Alaska, is well spoken, and that what works up there probably isn't solar, because they've got 6 months that they don't get much light at all, especially north of North Alaska. So I think that diesel generators, batteries, and wind power would be better for him.
And the thing is, for wind power, I was talking to one other fellow at a company. They make survival structures, and he said, it kind of really falls in line with what you were talking about, the generators. They're not all made the same. They're not all going to last. And there's also an issue of portability. If you're living in the suburbs, is there a practical kind of windmill you could put in, or is this really something you got to get out in the boonies?
No. When we start talking about urban windmills, we have to start talking about helical windmills, which instead of having blades that turn in a vertical plane, these turn in a horizontal plane. And they, much like the cups of a little anemometer that measures the wind speed. So these are designed to, and you can put them on top of your roof, and you can catch wind off of these things. Now, right now, city codes may say, no, we don't want an ugly windmill up there. But whenever it comes to a point that there is no power onto your house, you're in urban America, the survival instinct of the people will overpower the building code any day. I can almost guarantee you so.
Yeah, I think that's it's like you'll take my you'll have to take it from my dead hands,
Right. I'm trying to feed my baby and keep them warm and et cetera, and trying to keep the food from having problems or spoiling. So I think that the wind is going to be very viable for urban America and for in town, because then you will be able to put them on rooftop, even if it's using an extension cord. And these things don't produce AC. Typically, they produce DC power, so they'll charge batteries, and then we have to have this little electronic piece of gear called an inverter that turns it into AC. And it would be good.
How much would it cost for one of these? How much would it cost for one of these?
Oh, the helical wind mill will cost you somewhere around $1,500 to $2,200. You can buy two really good 15-year deep cycle batteries for about $400 to $500 a piece, and then you can buy an inverter for probably $1,000. So let's say you're into it for $4,000, and you now have the ability to generate electricity independent of the grid anywhere. Granted, you have to have wind, but as long as you've got the batteries, and some charge in the batteries, you've got radio. You can charge your cell phones if there's cell phone coverage. You can charge shortwave, which will always work. They're not dependent upon any infrastructure whatsoever, so I think shortwave is important. You can have lights. Those are the big important things that you need electricity for. Wood for heat, and propane if you can get a hold of it, and then solar collectors if there's no sun to heat.
So it's really, it's you have to be diverse in your strategy once you're really formally off the grid and you're not being serviced. And what I wanted to do was talk a little bit about how to protect this in terms of EMP, because that is going to be, to me, a really rough thing. But first, I just want to tell my listeners out there, if you'd like to call in, I've got a question for Dan. Please feel free. The guest call-in number is 818-495-6962. And when you call in, please remember to turn your player off, because the show is 1 minute delayed for security purposes, and you're just never going to figure out where you are in the questioning. So let me get back to this, Dan, and because this was a good question out of the virtual studio, and that is, how do you protect these windmills because they're generating power, and also if you have diesel or gasoline generators, these things, and they have electronic circuits in them, as most of them do these days, how do you make sure that this stuff doesn't get fried during the solar storm?
It's a very good question. The one good thing that you have going for you, if you are disconnected from the grid, is that the grid is like a huge antenna for EMP, and it will collect EMP and it will deliver it to your house for free of charge, and it will blow everything up in your house free of charge. And I don't mean literal explosion, but it'll burn it out. You understand what I'm saying? So
That's
if you're disconnected from the grid at that point, and you know that's going to happen, you can disconnect yourself from the grid, and that will eliminate the grid EMP from coming into your home. So now you only have to worry about your own home. And I think on a previous conversation you and I had, we talked about how to protect sort of smaller devices, using Faraday cages. I think that the generators, you don't have to worry about the alternator themselves. What you have to worry about is the control electronics, and they are completely encased, typically in a metal box. If it is in a plastic box, then it needs to be put into a metal box and sealed. And it has to be hermetically sealed so that we don't get waves. In any place there is not metal on the outside, including where the wires and the plastic are for the wires going into them, is a possible entry place for EMP. So we have to wrap everything with foil or put it into a hardened case. There are companies out there that actually build cases, EMP cases, called military hardened cases for electronics. But as far as the alternator itself, the listener does not have to worry about the alternator really having a problem. It's going to be the smaller electronics that are not geared toward taking large surges of power that burn out, like the integrated circuits and the chips and the little bitty stuff, the transistor radios and things of that nature that they just can't handle that kind of a power surge. Microwaves, there are going to be things that are affected in your home. Your TVs, your AV systems, your cell phones if they're not protected, shortwave if it's not protected. So you do not need to worry about your range or an electric stovetop. You don't have to worry about motors or your electric hot water heater or electric heat. You would need to worry about microwave because it's controlled by electronics. If it's a new electronic range or oven, that it will burn out the electronics, but not the heating elements in the house. Light bulbs, if you're not attached to the grid, the light bulbs will probably be just fine. So it's the smaller things that you have to really worry about, but they control everything. Computers control everything now, and so all that computer stuff needs to be protected or unplugged completely.
Right. Well, now that we've really had a good chance to look at all these different aspects of it, and it's a pretty deep topic. But, we've been kind of focusing on keeping this affordable for a family, but I noticed that, in our conversations over the phone, you're telling me about the clients that are coming to you to build bunkers.
Yep.
Specifically 2012 bunkers. And I remember the one you told me about, this fellow that went to his architect, and the architect thought he was one short of a six-pack, and he brought him to you, and you were able to talk his language. So I think it's an interesting story. I'd like you to share it with our listeners, and then talk about the kinds of things that you are doing for people who are preparing for 2012 and beyond and building bunkers, and they're not constrained with trying to juggle a family budget.
There are people out there that have access to higher level information than the common person. They're CEOs of companies, they are bankers, they are politicians, they're senators, they're presidents of other countries, they're doctors that live in other countries. People that have money that are politically tied and are being told that you need to prepare. Have you got your underground bunker, whether that's for atomic war or whether that's for the 2012 event or whatever the case may be. That there's a diverse set of beliefs out there of what may be coming up. But these people, we have a lot of people that are, money's not the issue. Safety is the issue. And the one story I was telling you about is that there was a builder that approached me at we were at a trade show, in fact, and we just happened to be talking, and he said, I was kind of telling him what we did, and he said, really? And he says, now, I need to warn you about this guy. This guy, he really out there. You know, he believes this stuff is going to, you know, all this stuff is going to happen, and he warned me, you know, substantially before I even met the gentleman. And I went down and met the gentleman. He started speaking about these things, and of course I knew exactly what he was talking about. And I started speaking his language, and the man set the deposit down on the desk right there and said, "I need you to build a house. Here's a deposit." And you know, he is connected. This man is connected with politicians. He regularly hangs out with politicians and with senators specifically, and other people within Europe and the United States. And these are the people that are telling him what's coming down. And so,
did he share any of that with you?
He did.
Exactly what you're telling him?
And
are you at liberty to discuss it?
Well, I can say some of the things, and I'll share as much as I would have known anyway. One of the things that was said by particular power elites recently is in a warning that they said specifically, and this was about 2 months, today, not tomorrow, go buy 6 months worth of food because you're going to need it this year. So this gentleman went, and he now, you know, there's many of them. There's literally hundreds and hundreds of people out there that have these food caches that are, you know, they're preparing for up to 5 years of without food. So, and he's talked about atomic war, that it's going to well, this is what one thing he told me, was that he was told that war was planned. It was strategically planned to begin in Israel and spread to the rest of the world. Whether that occurs or not, I'm no prophet. All I can do is repeat what men told me, that there is something that the governments are very concerned about, that they are spending literally trillions of dollars in building hundreds of deep underground military bases to house the power elite and the military, and certain billionaires, you know, people who could buy a golden ticket. And we've talked about that before. You know, it's 131 of these deep underground military bases in the United States alone. I've been in 2 of those myself.
I definitely want to hear about that.
Well, that's something I can't talk about on the air. But
oh, you mean you'd have to shoot me then? You know?
Yeah, something like that, or they'd shoot me, one of the two.
Okay, but you've been in those deep underground military bases, so you're.
2 of them. They are they're real. They're very real. There's nothing. There's not a farce. They're military operations, and each one has a strategic plan, and they are operating facilities, you know, for military. But they also have large living areas. And my understanding of the extent of one of them that I was in, it has 7 levels, and each level is 22 miles in diameter, with the extent of the buildings as it goes out underground.
Wow, that is massive.
Massive, and that's not even the big one. The big one is over in Europe that we spent $2.7 trillion of the U.S. money on. So
is that the one in Sweden?
That's it. That's the one.
Wow.
They're on the blackouts. It's
they got the best location.
Yeah, that gentleman was he was very concerned about the safety of his family, and he wanted this quickly. You know, he is firmly convinced that he has to be prepared by summer of next year, and so everything's going to be prepared by then. But he wants he's got you know, both underground and above ground, off-grid, above-ground home, and an underground bunker that is bomb-proof, and that he's got you know, food, and he has water. Thousands and thousands of gallons of water and fuel and waste areas and breathing air, and it's amazing how complex some of these are, Marshall. They have they're complete self-contained bunkers. You don't need air, you don't need water, you don't need everything. It's already stored there, and they have generators.
Just add survivors.
Yep, that's right. And they look like, you know, a $5 million condo in New York. They're gorgeous on the inside, absolutely gorgeous. Some of them, I've seen some has cost as much as $16 million for just the underground portion. Anyway,
wow.
There's a lot.
So
of
the people that have the money, I mean, you know, I sell my own books directly, and I've quite often had folks that have called me and said, well, I just bought me a missile silo, and here's a general location. And they're never going to give me exactly. They always talk about something that is, you know, about within 25 or 50 miles. And all they're asking me is, in terms of 2012, is it a good location? And once I'll look at it, I'll Google it on the map and look at whatever I know it to be various threat situation to them. And if I say, okay, it looks good, that's all they want to know. They don't want to know anything else. I find that interesting. Once they've got that information, once they've got a location, that's it. They clam up, disappear. In terms of dealing with your clients, do you find that they're equally tight-lipped in what they're going to share with you?
Not at all. Not at all. We usually have to sign non-disclosure. They normally tell us that all of the people that we bring into work on the job, none of them can be local. They can't be within, they'll say, 50 miles or 100 miles or 200 miles. In other words, none of them can really even know this is going on. You can bring them in from Texas or wherever they need to be, but they can't be from around where we're building the facility. And so it's fair. They don't want people to know that they even have them. So it's
right.
Why there's no names, and we certainly respect that, because I would want certainly want them to respect mine. I think that they do have money to do this, and it's of a very grave importance to them, and they want them built quickly. One gentleman that is in the business that I spoke to this last week actually it was this morning, he had 224 requests for proposals for underground bunkers that cost over $500,000 a piece just from the weekend, and he had 96 of them this morning whenever he arrived at his office. So you're talking about millions and millions and millions of dollars going into these underground bunkers, because people are very concerned about multiple things. They're concerned about what happened in Japan and the threat of radiation leakage. They're about the threat of atomic war for the first time in how long now? On news, they're talking about that we really think that we're going to go to war, atomic, nuclear war, that scares a lot of people. Scares me.
It scares me. I mean, it's you can only think of, what have Pakistan and North Korea been doing, and who are they selling what? You're looking at, for example, Saudi Arabia right now they're getting ready to actually just bust a move independent of the United States. They're tired of begging the United States to do something about Iran.
Yeah.
That could trigger God knows what kind of situations. So, in general, are you seeing with the customers that are coming to you, is comparing this with the previous history of your company, going back, say, a few years, has this been a gradual increase, or is it all of a sudden just starting to take off like a house afire?
It's probably the latter. There are certain economic events or political events that occur that will fuel them and to give them a little more momentum. It's like a big push. Somebody comes over and gives this big boulder a push, and it gives them more momentum. But what we're seeing is that the decline that this boulder is rolling down is getting steeper and steeper, so it's gaining its own momentum as we move into 2012. And the threat of nuclear war, the threat of the devaluation of the dollar. They're saying that the probability of us losing our AAA credit rating as a nation is highly probable. If we do that, oh my gosh, there's nothing to prop the dollar up any longer, So
that's right.
Inflation's going to go through the roof. Food's going to go through the roof. Gasoline is going to go through the roof. I watched this movie the other day, which I thought was really good, called Atlas Shrugged. And gasoline in this, it was set in the year 2015 through 2017, and gasoline was $37.50 a gallon.
Wow. And
I kind of tried to imagine that. It's like, wow. I think $75 is bad filling up the tank right now. So, but we have to think that way. Well, what happens if we do become completely energy independent and we're not buying, we're not importing any more oil? It's going to be political play here, because those who have are who we have to buy it from. And if they're not producing for whatever reason, or if they want to raise the rates, we're somewhat at their mercy, unless, a greater voice really starts making a difference. I know we're all trying. If, gasoline goes up, or if diesel, any of it, distribution could begin to shut down. And, the typical town only has a 7-day supply of food for its community. Any superstore, a supermarket. So you go, if distribution were to stop about 7 days later, you can pretty much expect the food to be gone. It's going to be slim pickings. So what do you do after that? And people don't think about that. That's one of the things we do is we stock these shelters with supplies, long-term supplies of foods, you know. So we have to think about these things. And waste disposal, it's not just, you know, how do you deal with the garbage? You know, that you've got garbage cans that you're cooking. So what do you do with the garbage? You know, especially if you're underground and you can't go up to the surface where it's irradiated. You know, so there's a lot of things to think about, and there's not much time left anyway. If we're talking about 2012 event, there's not much time left, and if people want to try to do this, they need to be making their decisions this summer, especially if they're going to build, because it can take a year to 18 months to build one of these things. So, you know, if they want to get into something, you know, from scratch, do it this summer. If they want to try to get off grid, that's much easier. It can take, you know, a couple of months. Unless you're out in the country. If you're out in the country, it can actually take a little bit less time than that. But anyway, we really encourage everyone to take a strong look at the safety, not for our sake, but for your own sake. It's about preparing and being ready for what may come. I don't want anyone to have to be dependent upon the government. I know there will be those. It was really sad when we were listening to TV, and they said if an atomic attack were to, or a nuclear attack were to hit the United States, only about 30% of the people would survive because the rest just are not able to or prepared to be able to survive something like that. So
yeah, I mean, that's,
we offer all the services that counts a consultation to help people try to prepare for that.
I find it personally frustrating because I see the people that are really the most vulnerable, the most likely to suffer in an event like this, and they're reticent about taking action. I don't see that with elites. I don't see that with I sell a lot of books to people who are involved in risk. Either they're taking risks, managing risks, evaluating risks, insuring risks, but in one way or another, there tend to be successful professionals who are dealing with a risk situation as opposed to someone that's just getting a 9-to-5 and a paycheck. And these folks are, I see them out there, and my God, they're proactive. I mean, they're just going to town. But for, you know, Joe Sixpack, it's kind of spotty. I mean, what I'm finding age-wise is it's actually folks in their mid-40s to up to mid-60s and into the 70s and 80s that are very proactive in planning and doing things. One of the things that impresses me most, Dan, is I see grandparents, great-grandparents who are, they're moving into rural situations, you know, getting like an old farm with 10 or 12 acres and some water. And they're setting aside provisions and supplies not only for themselves, but for other people, strangers as well. I mean, some of them are even going to, like, you know, Salvation Army and the such, and they're not only buying extra clothes, you know, to set them aside for themselves, but they're buying clothes for children, men, women, of all different ages, sizes, and ranges of clothing. And same thing with bedding and that kind of stuff, and setting that aside because they understand that, you know, the best way to get through something like this is with the help of someone else. And I find that very noble, and I find it very inspiring. But, you know, talking about the clients you're dealing with, the ones that are building these bunkers for $500,000 and more, are you seeing them do the same kind of thing, or is it dog eat dog? It's I'm taking care of me and my own, and you're going to have to do the same?
I would have to. That would be a two-part question. I believe that many of our clients have a heart for what is about to come, whatever they feel it is, and they're very concerned about other people. I do not know that there's only 4 or 5 perhaps that I know that are actually making provisions for people other than their own families that they may find out there as an interim, you know, walkthrough. The majority, if they're helping others, they're trying to help outside of their own personal bunker. You know, they've got a place that they're going to go to make sure that theirs of a family is secure, and then they can try to help other people through other organizations. You know, whether that be through FEMA or whether it's personally or if they just sponsor people. But I don't see, there's very, very few that I have seen that are actually a community that's trying to build a shelter, a refuge to try to help people get through hard times. So there's one in Canada I'm aware of, and there's some community that I'm aware of that are coming together with, many different families that they would be, quite willing to help people if they want to come in and become part of the community. But as far as our clientele, I guess we haven't had any of the ones that were coming to build a 28 or 30 or 50,000 square foot underground bunker to try to house a lot of people.
Yeah, I see that too, and when I see folks really trying to plan to help others and folks that they don't even know yet, I find that very encouraging, and I just wish I could see a whole lot more of it. Maybe it's more of it out there, who knows. But in the time remaining, what I want to ask you a question is, we've been talking about keeping power for a family home and some things that you can do reasonably within a budget of a few $1,000s. And but at some point, you got to leave the house. You're going to have to hit the road. You're going to have to go somewhere, and now it's keeping radios working, maybe a laptop if there's going to be some kind of internet presence. In those kind of situations, everyone always has the classic solution, get a bicycle. Are you still there? I am back. Are you still there now? Yeah. Apparently somebody you've done business with or someone else didn't particularly like it, and they hosed my connection. So I had to phone back in. Such is life. Well, it always happens. Well, I don't know if it's your customers. It's those disinfo pukes out of London, they're the ones that really cause the big amount of grief. But, yeah, so be it. We had some dead air there. But in the meantime, when people are trying to stay connected and they're rocking and rolling, how are they going to be able to do that effectively with just a small, keeping it small, something you can put in a backpack, something you can generate some power, get your cell phones, get your radio charged up, and you're going to be in a situation where it's going to be low light conditions, it's difficult. Are there hand crank generators, those kind of things? What would you recommend?
I would recommend having a bicycle and attaching the back wheel of that bicycle to a car alternator and let it charge up a car battery, a 12-volt battery. And it takes a lot of energy to try to produce power to even run a light bulb or a car. You'd be surprised that you can only create enough energy to drive a television by riding this bicycle. But instead of watching television, just charge the battery and use the battery later. So that would be my suggestion to people. There are cranks, those are good for shortwave radios, for lights, things of that nature, but they don't create enough energy in enough enough time to use anything big. So I would recommend having a bicycle and just being able to adapt it to just a regular 12-volt alternator off of a car, and it runs it'll be hooked directly to a regular 12-volt car battery, and that battery can drive all kinds of things, including an inverter. But if we're talking about, you can carry in your backpack in your car, bicycles are good, a battery would be fine, and having that little alternator would be great. I think that's probably about the best thing to be able to hang on to for electricity, and that's assuming we don't have solar capabilities.
Yeah.
Always keep shortwave with you. You know that. That's how we'll be able to communicate with each other. Shortwave radio, one of the handhelds. They always work. They're not dependent upon any infrastructure. So if all the infrastructures go down, as long as they've been protected from EMP, they'll continue to work.
Okay. Are there any that you'd recommend?
As far as shortwaves, no. There's a lot of them out there. 10 meter is a really good, easy, reliable band to get, a 10 meter shortwave radio. But there's a lot of them out there. It's going to depend upon their budget, because you can spend anywhere from $300 to $30,000 on shortwave.
Yeah, you really put a lot of money into it. But definitely the shortwave, staying in connection with other folks, and some good radiation shielding is going to be very important. Let's say I get a handheld shortwave unit, And how would the best way to protect that against EMP and solar flare radiation?
Well, these Boy Scout popcorn cans that the popcorn comes in that has the dividers in them, those are great because they're all metal and they have a tight lid, and you can put aluminum foil. I would recommend 2 thicknesses of aluminum foil, freezer thickness aluminum foil, around the rim of the can, and then put the lid on it. Keep all your cell phone, if you're going to have a cell phone, if it even works, or keep your shortwave in there. Keep anything that's volatile, your MP3 player, whatever you want to keep in there. Even a laptop computer. If you get a little bit larger can, you can put your laptop in there. Now, once you open it up, you need to put new foil around the edge because there can't be any tears. Where there is space for air to get through, EMP can also get through.
Got it. Got it. Well, would you do our listeners a favor? Let them know your website so they can go visit that. You got a great website, and there's a lot of good information there.
www.g.
All right. Well, Dan, this has been a great interview, and we've got an active chat room. No questions on the call-in lines, and so we'll call it a night, and I do appreciate you coming by.
You bet. You have a great night. Thank you.
In planning, how are you going to adapt to the changes that are coming? We always talk about shortages of oil. Well, let's not talk about shortages of oil. Let's talk about shortages of oil infrastructure. All right? Remember back to Katrina? Dig out those old gas and food receipts. Remember the jolt that we got after all of that infrastructure was wiped out? Well, that's what happens. Now, how's that going to affect us? Well, as natural catastrophes start to happen, we're going to see a contraction, and it's going to come in a series of contractions of the nation's ability to provide continuous 24/7 energy. And consequently, we're going to see rolling brownouts, rolling blackouts, and they're going to happen all too frequently. So that means each of us needs to find a way to get as far off the grid as possible. And that means working with what you have in your budget. To help us do that, we have Daniel Dean. He's the CEO and Chief Engineer for Greenland Energy Dynamics, a firm based outside of Dallas, Texas, that specializes in getting people off the grid. And he's got a very respectable list of people who are coming to his business, and frankly, the guy's just on fire, can barely keep up with demand. And so what I'd like to do is bring Dan on, and we're going to talk about things you can do about getting off the grid, and I'm talking about getting off the grid so you can survive the earth changes that are coming for everybody's budget. And so I'd like to introduce to the show Daniel Green. Dan, thanks for coming on.
Hello, Marshall. How are you this evening?
Well, I'm excellent. I am excellent, and I'm really glad you come on for this first show, just so the audience knows that Dan and I joined with Dan and other gentlemen, and we had a nice paddle down the river in Arkansas. That was quite a 3-day expedition. We did 35 miles of the river, and that was a heck of a bonding experience. So let me put it to you this way, folks.
Grid, huh?
Yeah, it really was. Boy, we were off of society. We were off of everything, and so I'm used to putting my life in your hands, and I'm comfortable with it, and that's what I'd like for my listeners to know. So first off, Dan, why don't you just tell people a little bit about what Greenland Energy is doing, and what you think folks in the mainstream, down on Main Street, can do within limited budgets to get as far off the flipping grid as possible.
All right. Well, Greenland started out as a company providing alternative energy products such as solar electric, solar thermal, geothermal heating and air conditioning, standby generators, LED lighting, anything that would reduce the consumption of energy in a house. And we didn't really target going off-grid. This kind of came by customers asking us and saying, look, I really want to get off the grid. I don't want the electric hooked up to my house, or what if the electricity goes off? What do I do? How can I, continue to function on a daily basis? Or they're concerned about the, increased pricing of electricity. And so we started designing systems for people that had estates or farms or a place that they wanted to completely take off grid and not have to worry about utilities in the future. Doesn't matter what the prices are. And we've developed into pretty good clientele. Some of them can develop some build some very nice estates. And some of them, can't, so we try to help them the best we can. We each have a budget. I think where you were talking about helping people on Main Street, that's the big area that we like to help people. I think there's a lot of practical and simple things that we can do in our homes, the things that we can expect, and this is an opinion, but it's an educated opinion. Every 10 years, energy prices or electric prices double. We know that just from historical data. We also know that we've got carbon footprint tax that's coming along that's going to impose a 30% tax just right off the board on our energy bills. We know that we've got tiered pricing on energy. Like California already has, I think, a 4-tiered pricing structure. Texas is trying to get that through the legislature to where we may pay 10 cents a kilowatt hour right now, but only for a very limited amount of energy, and we could pay in the upwards of 36, 37 cents a kilowatt hour. And people are concerned about that because that's going to make some drastic cuts on their budgets, big impact, especially at a time when corporate America is cutting back on salaries, trying to equalize salaries within the corporate structures. A lot of people are unemployed. They're on one income right now.
Well, I'll tell you, it's bloody hell out there. We just finished a huge move, getting into a new place. It was time for me to bust a move and to get to where I needed to be for 2012, and I got here, and it gave me a chance to see what's happening out, particularly in the rental market out there. And Dan, it's just ugly. You have families that are in foreclosures and short sales, and evictions. It's just awful, and the slumlords and the predators are out there like never before, just to rip these poor people off. And I know that there's a lot of folks out there that are really sweating something like that happening, and so it's getting off the grid is one of those things. Do you do it before or after you make those minimum credit card payments that seem to be not so minimum anymore? And finding the little things, that's helpful. Yeah.
My grown son was just telling me the other day that he's getting advertisements for credit cards now that are upwards of 17 to 24%, no longer the 6 or 7 or 8 or 9% credit cards. And so we were already
what rate? What was that?
16 to 24%.
On a solicitation?
Solicitation, amazing. He was telling me about it. He said he couldn't believe it. He normally gets them for 6 or 7 or 9, maybe 10%, 9.99%. A bad one would be 14%. And I was amazed to see some of them that he was showing me. And it's like, well, the inflationary cycle has begun. Of course, we've been watching gold and silver, and we know that's occurring. So we just need to try to brace ourselves and prepare for it.
Yeah, absolutely. And, for the families that are out there, I know that in my particular case, getting out we got out in a rural area, and I've switched over pretty heavily to, propane and firewood. Get myself away from electric as much as possible. For the average person, though, is propane and firewood going to work for them if they're in the cities?
Well, it's a good question. I think that propane is questionable. It's very up to the city code and where they live. If someone can get propane, whether their house is running on propane right now or not, and they don't have natural gas available to them, I would have it put in their house. And I'll explain in a moment. I think the first thing that I would suggest to everyone out there, unless they're getting ready to build